I want to start with a truth that many people spend years avoiding. The people who receive the most from you are not always the people who value you the most. That realization is often shocking, especially for empaths. For years, they become the person everyone can rely on. The listener, the helper, the peacemaker. The one who stays calm when others lose control. The one who gives second chances, then third chances, and sometimes far more than that. They step into conflicts to create harmony. They carry emotional burdens that do not belong to them. They make themselves available at all hours. They put other people's needs ahead of their own and convince themselves that this is what kindness looks like. Yet, beneath that generosity, a quiet exhaustion begins to grow. Little by little, they start feeling drained, overlooked, and strangely disconnected from themselves. The most surprising part is that many empaths do not notice this happening until they reach a breaking point. One day, the energy is gone. The desire to keep fixing, rescuing, and pleasing everyone disappears. Not because they have become bitter, not because they no longer care, but because they finally see the cost of living for everyone except themselves. And that is where the real story begins. What happens next is rarely discussed. Most people talk about empathy as a gift, but very few talk about what occurs when an empath stops giving unlimited access to their time, emotions, and energy. The reactions can be unexpected. Some people become distant, some become uncomfortable, some become angry. Relationships that once seemed strong suddenly begin to change. Hidden motives rise to the surface. Unspoken expectations become visible. Patterns that remained invisible for years can no longer be ignored. In many cases, the empath discovers that certain connections were never as balanced as they appeared. This is not just an emotional experience. Psychology shows that people often become accustomed to roles within relationships. When one person changes the role they have always played, the entire dynamic is forced to change as well. That shift can reveal truths that were hiding in plain sight all along. In this video, you will learn why people-pleasing becomes so deeply connected to an empath's identity, how emotional exhaustion develops without warning, why setting boundaries often creates guilt before it creates freedom, and what truly happens when an empath begins seeing relationships through a clearer lens. You will also discover lesser-known psychological patterns that explain why some people resist healthy boundaries and why others respect them. Most importantly, you will learn how the journey from constant approval-seeking to self-respect transforms the way an empath sees both themselves and the world around them. By the end of this video, a lot of behaviors that once seemed confusing may suddenly make perfect sense. So stay with us until the end, because the final insight may completely change the way you understand empathy, relationships, and personal growth. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy deep psychological insights and powerful lessons about human nature, make sure to subscribe and join us for more videos like this. Let's begin. Before the empath begins to see the truth, there is usually a role they have been playing for so long that they no longer realize it is a role. It feels natural. It feels normal. In many cases, it starts early in life. The empath becomes highly aware of other people's moods, reactions, and emotional states. They notice tension before anyone says a word. They sense disappointment behind a smile. They can feel sadness hidden beneath anger. While other people move through conversations without noticing these subtle signals, the empath absorbs them almost automatically. Over time, this ability becomes part of their identity. They learn that helping others creates peace. They learn that understanding others earns appreciation. They learn that being available makes them valuable. Without realizing it, they slowly step into the position of caretaker, not because anyone officially assigns them that role, but because it seems to happen naturally wherever they go. Friends begin coming to them with problems. Family members rely on them for emotional support. Partners expect understanding and patience. Coworkers trust them with personal struggles. The empath becomes the person who listens when everyone else is tired of listening. The person who stays calm when others become emotional. The person who offers comfort when situations become difficult. At first, this feels meaningful. It feels like purpose. There is satisfaction in helping people feel better. There is pride in being dependable. There is a sense of importance in being needed. Yet hidden beneath this pattern is a belief that often goes unnoticed. The belief is that their value comes from what they provide to others. The more they help, the more worthy they feel. The more they give, the more accepted they feel. Approval slowly becomes connected to self-worth. This connection is rarely obvious. Most empaths would never say that they need approval. In fact, many believe they are simply being kind. But when approval becomes linked to identity, certain behaviors begin to appear. The empath becomes uncomfortable disappointing people. They become anxious when someone is upset with them. They feel guilty when they cannot solve a problem. They feel responsible when relationships become strained. Their emotional state starts depending on how other people feel about them. If everyone is happy, they feel successful. If someone is angry, they feel like they have failed. This creates a cycle that can continue for years. The empath becomes increasingly focused on maintaining harmony, because harmony feels connected to safety, acceptance, and worth. One of the most exhausting parts of this cycle is the hidden habit of managing other people's emotions. Many empaths do this without even realizing it. They constantly monitor conversations for signs of discomfort. They adjust their words to avoid upsetting others. They soften criticism. They hide frustration. They suppress opinions. They become experts at reading emotional reactions and adjusting their behavior accordingly. While this may appear thoughtful from the outside, it often comes at a tremendous cost. The empath begins carrying emotional responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. They start believing that it is their job to prevent conflict, reduce tension, and keep everyone comfortable. This responsibility gradually grows larger. If a friend is unhappy, the empath feels responsible for cheering them up. If a family member is stressed, the empath feels responsible for fixing the situation. If a partner is upset, the empath feels responsible for restoring peace. They rarely stop to ask whether these responsibilities actually belong to them. Instead, they automatically step forward and take them on. Over time, pleasing people no longer feels like a choice. It starts feeling like an obligation. Saying yes becomes easier than saying no. Sacrificing personal needs becomes easier than risking disappointment. Giving becomes automatic. The problem is that every relationship begins adapting to this behavior. People become accustomed to the empath's availability. They become accustomed to their patience. They become accustomed to their willingness to help. What started as generosity slowly becomes expectation. The empath often does not notice this shift because it happens gradually. They continue giving because it feels normal. They continue supporting because it feels right. Yet each act of self-sacrifice reinforces the belief that their role is to serve the emotional needs of others. As months turn into years, the imbalance becomes more difficult to see. The empath may begin feeling tired, but they tell themselves everyone gets tired. They may feel unappreciated, but they convince themselves they should not expect anything in return. They may feel overwhelmed, but they believe helping people is simply part of who they are. Instead of questioning the pattern, they push themselves harder. They become more available, more understanding, more forgiving, more patient. Yet every time they ignore their own needs, they move a little further away from themselves. At first, this behavior looks like kindness. It looks compassionate. It looks generous. People often praise it. Society often rewards it. Yet beneath the surface, something dangerous begins to happen. The empath slowly loses sight of where other people's responsibilities end and their own begin. Their identity becomes so focused on helping others that they struggle to recognize their own needs, desires, and emotions. The line between compassion and self-abandonment becomes blurred. This is where the cost begins to emerge. Emotional burnout rarely arrives suddenly. It develops quietly. The empath wakes up one day feeling slightly more tired than usual, then a little more exhausted the following week, then increasingly drained over the following months. Because they are so accustomed to focusing on others, they often ignore the warning signs. They tell themselves they just need rest. They tell themselves things will improve soon. They continue giving despite feeling depleted. The cycle continues because stopping feels uncomfortable. Helping has become part of their identity. Without it, they are not entirely sure who they are. As emotional exhaustion grows, another feeling begins to appear: resentment. This can be confusing for empaths because resentment seems to conflict with their caring nature. They genuinely want to help people. They genuinely love the people in their lives. Yet deep inside, frustration begins building. They notice that they are always the one making sacrifices. They notice that their needs rarely receive the same attention. They notice that support often flows in one direction because they dislike conflict. They usually keep these feelings hidden. They smile. They remain supportive. They continue giving. Meanwhile, the resentment grows quietly beneath the surface. This hidden resentment creates an internal conflict. Part of the empath wants to continue helping. Another part feels increasingly exhausted by the demands placed upon them. They begin feeling trapped between compassion and self-preservation. Every request for help feels heavier. Every emotional burden feels larger. Every expectation feels more difficult to carry. Yet they continue saying yes because saying no feels selfish. The guilt associated with prioritizing themselves often feels stronger than the discomfort of self-sacrifice. As this pattern continues, personal needs begin disappearing into the background. Goals are postponed, rest is delayed, boundaries are ignored, dreams are set aside. The empath becomes so focused on supporting others that they rarely invest the same energy into themselves. They know what everyone else needs. They know what everyone else feels. But when asked what they need or how they feel, they often struggle to answer. Their attention has been directed outward for so long that their connection with themselves begins fading. The pressure becomes even heavier because many empaths start feeling responsible for everyone's happiness. They believe relationships succeed when everyone feels good. They believe peace must be maintained at all costs. They believe conflict means failure. This mindset places an impossible burden on their shoulders. Human emotions are complex. People experience disappointment, frustration, sadness, and anger for countless reasons. Yet the empath often acts as though it is their duty to prevent those emotions from occurring. The result is constant pressure and endless emotional labor. Eventually, the empath begins losing connection with their own identity. They become so skilled at adapting to others that they forget what feels authentic. They know how to be supportive. They know how to be understanding. They know how to be agreeable. But they struggle to identify their own preferences without considering everyone else's needs first. The person who once felt deeply connected to their emotions now feels disconnected from themselves. The role of caretaker has become so dominant that it overshadows everything else. There comes a point when the emotional cost becomes too high to ignore. The exhaustion reaches a level that can no longer be explained away. The resentment becomes impossible to suppress. The imbalance becomes impossible to justify. For some empaths, this realization arrives after a betrayal. For others, it comes after repeated disappointment. Sometimes it appears during a period of intense stress. Sometimes it arrives during a quiet moment of reflection. Regardless of how it happens, the awareness begins growing. They start questioning patterns they once accepted without hesitation. The first changes are often small. The empath stops over-explaining every decision. They stop writing lengthy messages trying to prevent misunderstandings. They stop spending hours justifying simple choices. They begin recognizing that not every decision requires permission or approval. This shift may seem minor, but it represents a profound change in thinking. For years, they felt responsible for managing how others perceived them. Now they begin realizing that not every reaction belongs to them. Soon, boundaries begin appearing where none existed before. The empath starts protecting their time. They become more selective about where they invest their energy. They begin recognizing that availability should not be unlimited. These boundaries often feel uncomfortable at first. The empath worries about appearing selfish. They worry about disappointing people. They worry about damaging relationships. Yet despite these fears, they continue moving forward because they can no longer ignore the cost of living without boundaries. Then comes the moment many empaths fear most, the first real no, a simple word, a short response. Yet emotionally, it can feel enormous. The empath may replay the conversation repeatedly afterward. They may question whether they were too harsh. They may worry about how the other person feels. They may experience guilt almost immediately. Years of conditioning have taught them that saying yes creates acceptance, while saying no creates risk. Breaking that pattern is rarely easy. The fear of disappointing others becomes especially intense during this stage. The empath often assumes that healthy boundaries will push people away. They expect rejection. They expect criticism. They expect conflict. Every step towards self-respect feels accompanied by uncertainty. Yet something remarkable begins happening. The more they honor their own needs, the more clearly they start seeing the reality of their relationships. The guilt remains present for a while. In fact, many empaths mistake guilt for evidence that they are doing something wrong. They assume discomfort means they should return to old behaviors. But the guilt is often a sign that they are breaking long-established patterns. It is the emotional residue of years spent prioritizing everyone else. As difficult as it feels, the guilt is not the most important part of the transformation. The most surprising part is what happens in other people. As boundaries become stronger, reactions begin appearing. Some people become distant. Individuals who once contacted the empath constantly suddenly disappear. Conversations become less frequent. Invitations stop coming. The relationship begins fading. At first, this can feel painful. The empath may wonder what went wrong. But slowly they begin noticing a pattern. The distance often appears only after access becomes limited. Other people respond with anger. They become frustrated by limits that never existed before. They question the empath's decisions. They accuse them of changing. They express disappointment. The empath, who once would have rushed to repair the situation, starts observing these reactions more carefully. They begin asking themselves an important question. Why does a healthy boundary create such a strong response? Some individuals become manipulative. They use guilt. They use pressure. They remind the empath of past favors. They imply selfishness. They attempt to trigger obligation. These tactics often worked in the past because the empath was highly sensitive to disappointment. But now the pattern becomes visible. What once felt like normal interaction starts looking very different. Others try restoring the old dynamic. They push against the new boundaries. They test limits repeatedly. They continue making the same demands. They act as though nothing has changed. The empath begins recognizing how invested some people were in the previous version of the relationship. Not because they valued the empath as a person, but because they benefited from unlimited access to their time, attention, patience, and emotional support. With each reaction, the truth becomes clearer. The empath starts seeing the difference between respect and dependence. They begin identifying who genuinely cares about their well-being and who primarily cares about maintaining access to what they provide. Relationships that once seemed identical begin revealing important differences. Some people adjust respectfully. Some people become supportive. Some people appreciate the healthier dynamic. Others resist every step of the change. The deeper the empath looks, the more visible these patterns become. They realize that healthy relationships do not collapse because of reasonable boundaries. Healthy relationships adapt. Healthy relationships respect limits. Healthy relationships allow both people to have needs. What boundaries often destroy are unhealthy expectations. What boundaries often expose are imbalances that existed long before anyone acknowledged them. And as this realization settles in, the empath begins seeing people, relationships, and themselves with a level of clarity they have never experienced before. For many empaths, the deepest shock does not come from setting boundaries. It does not come from saying no. It does not even come from watching certain people become distant. The real shock arrives when they begin looking back and noticing patterns that were present all along. For years, they believed many of their relationships were built on deep emotional connection. They believed loyalty, care, and understanding were flowing in both directions. They believed the people around them valued them for who they were. But after stepping out of the role of constant giver, a different picture begins to emerge. Slowly, they start recognizing that some relationships were built less on connection and more on access. Access to their time, access to their energy, access to their patience, access to their emotional support. As long as that access remained unlimited, everything seemed stable, everything seemed healthy, everything seemed secure. But once limits appeared, the foundation of certain relationships began revealing itself. This realization is difficult because it forces the empath to re-examine experiences they once interpreted differently. Conversations that seemed harmless now look different. Interactions that once felt normal begin revealing hidden expectations. They start noticing how often they were the one initiating contact, how often they were the one checking in, how often they were the one offering support without receiving the same level of care in return. They begin noticing how some people only appeared during moments when they needed something: advice, comfort, attention, validation, emotional labor. The empath starts connecting dots that remained scattered for years. Each realization adds another piece to the puzzle. The more awareness grows, the more repeated patterns become impossible to ignore. Different people, different situations, different relationships, yet somehow the same dynamic keeps appearing. The empath gives, others receive. The empath sacrifices, others benefit. The empath adjusts, others remain comfortable. What once looked like isolated incidents begins forming a larger pattern. This can be both painful and enlightening. Painful, because it reveals how much energy was invested in relationships that lacked balance. Enlightening, because it finally explains feelings that never fully made sense before. One of the biggest shifts occurs when the empath stops confusing need with love. This confusion is more common than many people realize. When someone constantly depends on an empath, it can feel like love. When someone frequently seeks their advice, comfort, or support, it can feel like closeness. When someone cannot function without their presence, it can feel like importance. But dependence and love are not the same thing. Need and love are not the same thing. A person can need what you provide without truly valuing who you are. A person can depend on your support without respecting your well-being. This distinction becomes clearer as boundaries begin separating genuine connection from emotional dependency. The empath also starts questioning another belief they carried for years, the belief that sacrifice automatically creates loyalty. For a long time, they assumed that giving more would strengthen relationships. They assumed that enduring discomfort for others would be appreciated. They assumed that loyalty meant continuing to give regardless of personal cost. Yet experience begins teaching a different lesson. Sacrifice alone does not guarantee respect. Sacrifice alone does not create healthy relationships. In some situations, excessive sacrifice simply teaches people to expect more. The empath begins realizing that loyalty without boundaries can become self-abandonment disguised as virtue. As these insights deepen, another realization emerges. Being useful is not the same as being valued. This truth often strikes with tremendous force, because many empaths have spent years connecting usefulness with worth. They became the helper, the problem solver, the supporter, the emotional anchor. Their value felt connected to what they contributed. But genuine value extends beyond usefulness. True connection remains present even when a person cannot give endlessly. True respect survives boundaries. True care does not disappear the moment access becomes limited. Understanding this difference changes how the empath views nearly every relationship in their life. The emotional impact of these discoveries can be overwhelming. There may be sadness, there may be disappointment, there may even be grief. Not necessarily grief over losing people, but grief over losing illusions. The empath mourns the version of reality they once believed in. They mourn assumptions that felt comforting. They mourn the belief that effort always creates reciprocity. Yet despite the pain, a new kind of freedom begins emerging. Freedom from constantly chasing approval. Freedom from endless emotional obligations. Freedom from relationships built on imbalance. Freedom from carrying responsibilities that never truly belong to them. This realization hurts, but it also creates freedom. Yet freedom does not always feel empowering in the beginning. In fact, one of the most difficult stages often comes immediately afterward. The empath enters a strange period that feels unfamiliar and uncertain. A period where old patterns no longer fit, but new patterns have not fully formed. A period where clarity exists, but confidence is still developing. This is the lonely middle stage. The loneliness can be surprising. After all, the empath may still be surrounded by people. Friends may still exist. Family members may still be present. Conversations may still happen. Yet internally, everything feels different. The familiar role that once defined their interactions has changed. They are no longer automatically available. They are no longer constantly managing everyone's emotions. They are no longer sacrificing themselves to maintain harmony. Because of this, relationships begin feeling unfamiliar. The empath feels as though they are learning how to exist in a completely different way. During this stage, isolation often appears. Not because the empath wants to be alone, but because they are no longer participating in old dynamics. Some relationships naturally fade. Some connections weaken. Some people drift away. The absence created by these changes can feel unsettling. There may be moments when silence feels louder than noise. Moments when the empath wonders whether they made the right decision. Moments when they question whether maintaining boundaries was worth the cost. This questioning is normal. Human beings naturally seek familiarity. Even unhealthy patterns can feel comforting simply because they are familiar. The empath may find themselves missing relationships that caused stress, missing people who rarely reciprocated, missing dynamics that left them exhausted. This
Empaths
confusion often occurs because they are not only losing relationships, they are losing routines, expectations, and identities that existed for years. What they miss is not always the person. Sometimes they miss the predictability. There are days when doubt becomes particularly strong. The empath remembers positive memories. They focus on moments of connection. They wonder whether they were too strict, too distant, too firm. They replay conversations repeatedly. They question boundaries that were actually reasonable. Old conditioning continues whispering familiar messages. Maybe you should have done more. Maybe you should have been more understanding. Maybe you should have sacrificed a little longer. These thoughts can be difficult to resist because they echo beliefs that shaped much of their life. At the same time, the empath begins learning a skill they may have avoided for years: sitting with discomfort. In the past, discomfort often triggered action. If someone was upset, they fixed it. If tension appeared, they resolved it. If conflict emerged, they managed it. But now they start learning that not every uncomfortable feeling requires immediate intervention. Not every emotional reaction needs to be solved. Not every relationship needs to be rescued. This lesson is challenging because it requires patience. The empath must learn to tolerate uncertainty without rushing to restore old patterns. They must learn to trust that temporary discomfort is not evidence of failure. They must learn that growth often feels uncomfortable precisely because it requires change. Every moment spent resisting old habits strengthens new ones. Every boundary maintained reinforces self-respect. Every difficult conversation survived builds confidence. Slowly, another process begins: the rebuilding of self-trust. For many years, the empath trusted external feedback more than internal guidance. They looked to other people's reactions to determine whether they were doing the right thing. Approval became evidence of success. Disapproval became evidence of failure. But now they start turning inward. They begin asking themselves different questions. What feels healthy? What feels honest? What aligns with my values? What protects my well-being? These questions gradually become more important than external validation. Self-trust develops one decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one moment of courage at a time. The empath starts realizing that they can survive disappointment. They can survive criticism. They can survive misunderstandings. Most importantly, they can survive without constant approval. This realization creates a foundation that is stronger than anything external validation could provide. Growth often feels lonely before it feels empowering. And as self-trust grows stronger, the empath begins seeing themselves with new clarity. The need for constant approval starts losing its power. Reactions that once felt overwhelming become easier to navigate. Criticism no longer carries the same emotional weight. Disagreement no longer feels like rejection. The empath begins understanding that their worth does not rise and fall based on how pleased other people are. This shift changes everything. For the first time, they stop measuring themselves through the eyes of others. They stop asking whether everyone approves. They stop trying to earn acceptance through endless giving. They stop performing versions of themselves designed to make everyone comfortable. Instead, they begin focusing on authenticity, on honesty, on alignment between their actions and their values. Their intuition also becomes stronger. For years, intuition was often drowned out by obligation. The empath sensed red flags but ignored them. They noticed unhealthy behavior but explained it away. They felt discomfort but convinced themselves they were overreacting. Now those instincts become easier to hear. Without the constant pressure to maintain approval, they can finally pay attention to what their intuition has been telling them all along. As this awareness develops, manipulation becomes easier to recognize. Tactics that once created guilt lose much of their influence. Emotional pressure becomes visible. Attempts to create obligation become obvious. The empath begins seeing behavior patterns instead of getting lost in emotional reactions. This does not make them cynical. It makes them discerning. They remain compassionate, but their compassion is no longer blind. Another important change begins taking place. The empath starts choosing peace over performance. In the past, much of their energy was spent maintaining an image: the reliable one, the understanding one, the endlessly patient one, the person who could handle everything. But maintaining that image required constant effort. It required suppressing needs, hiding frustrations, and ignoring limits. Now they begin choosing peace instead. They stop trying to prove their goodness through exhaustion. They stop trying to demonstrate their value through sacrifice. This creates a deeper sense of stability. The empath no longer feels pressured to earn belonging. They no longer feel responsible for maintaining every relationship. They no longer feel obligated to carry emotional burdens that belong to other people. Their self-respect becomes stronger because it is built on truth rather than performance. And this is where the real transformation begins. The empath reaches a point where they finally understand something that changes everything. A truth that was hidden beneath years of people-pleasing, over-giving, and emotional responsibility. A truth that was always present but impossible to see while trapped inside old patterns. They were never responsible for saving everyone. They were never responsible for carrying everyone's pain. They were never responsible for keeping every relationship alive. These realizations do not arrive all at once. They arrive gradually, through experience, through disappointment, through growth, through clarity. Each lesson removes another layer of unnecessary responsibility. Each insight frees them from burdens they were never meant to carry. The empath begins recognizing that every person is responsible for their own choices, their own healing, their own growth, their own emotional work. Compassion can support people, but it cannot live their lives for them. Love can encourage people, but it cannot force change. Care can be offered, but it cannot replace personal responsibility. As this understanding deepens, relationships become clearer than ever before. The people who truly care remain. They adapt to boundaries. They respect limits. They value honesty. They appreciate authenticity. They support growth even when it changes the relationship. And the people who only benefited begin fading into the background. Some leave quietly, some leave angrily. Some leave dramatically. But eventually the difference becomes impossible to ignore. For the first time, the empath is no longer distracted by guilt, obligation, or endless responsibility. For the first time, they can see the difference clearly. When the empath stops pleasing everyone, they do not become selfish, they become aware. Aware of unhealthy patterns that once felt normal. Aware of relationships that survived on access instead of genuine connection. Aware of expectations that were never theirs to carry. And most importantly, aware of their own value. For years, many empaths believe that love must be earned through sacrifice. That acceptance comes from giving more, doing more, and carrying more. They become so focused on taking care of others that they forget to take care of themselves. But eventually, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest transformation is not learning how to help others. It is learning that your worth does not depend on how much of yourself you give away. Your value is not measured by how many problems you solve. It is not measured by how much pain you absorb. It is not measured by how many people depend on you. Real self-worth begins the moment you understand that you are valuable, even when you are resting, even when you say no, even when you stop explaining yourself, even when you choose your own peace. And once an empath sees that truth, there is no going back, because they begin seeing people differently. They begin seeing relationships differently. And for the first time, they begin seeing themselves clearly. The version of them that was hidden beneath years of guilt, obligation, and people-pleasing finally steps forward. Not harder, not colder, not less caring, just wiser, and that wisdom changes everything. So before you go, take a moment and ask yourself this question. How much of your life has been spent trying to keep everyone else comfortable while ignoring your own needs? The answer may reveal more than you expect. If this video resonated with you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. And remember, the people who truly value you will not leave because you set boundaries. They will respect them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.